Well, hello. I'd like to welcome everybody to this MediaNorth meeting. Normally at this time on a Sunday afternoon on the second week of August, we'd be at Wortley Hall for the South Yorkshire Festival. Sadly, for another year, it's been suspended. Maybe it was a good time, Pat. I see you're there. With the weather, it might have been a risky business today. But anyway, I'm really pleased that a number of you have joined us for what I think is an exceptionally important meeting, highlighted as well by the crass, insensitive comments of a Prime Minister made earlier in the week, whose sensitivity about the scale of devastation in mining communities caused by the pit closures after 84-85 and after 93, he seems to be totally unaware of. Now, Hugh, Beynon and Ray Hudson have written a very important book, The Shadow of the Mine. And this afternoon, I'm really delighted that they're both here to be able to speak about the book and the reasons why they've written it and what they hope to achieve through stimulating the discussion around it. Also, Jean Spence, Jean from Seaham in County Durham, very actively involved in mining community debates and writing about them over the years, and Nick Jones. So we're going to start the event by asking Hugh and Ray to speak. We want to have plenty of discussion, so we're aiming to have quite short 10-minute contributions from the speakers and then move on to questions and comments. So first of all, can I welcome you all to this MediaNorth meeting? And always I have to give a plug. We produce a quarterly issue of MediaNorth. There's a review of Ray's and Hugh's book in the summer issue, which you can read online at www.medianorth.org.uk. But we also organise meetings like this where we seek to stimulate debate about issues to do with the media and also current affairs. So over to you, Hugh, and very welcome you are to this afternoon's event. Hugh.
Well, thank you, Granville, and thank you for organising this event and for inviting us. And it's nice to feel as if I'm almost in Wortley Hall. It's I have many happy times there over the years, and I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about the book, about why we did it and what's it about, really, and then they will pick up some themes. Really, it's a book about the men and women of the coalfields. It focuses on South Wales and Durham, but there are many points of general reference. And it's an historical book, but the large proportion of it looks at the time after the strike in 1984-5 and the situation of the coalfields and the coal communities after the closures of the collieries. I was brought up in South Wales and moved to Durham in the late 70s and 80s, where I met up with Ray, and we met up at workshops. Ray was looking at the impact of the future of coal upon the local communities, and I was talking with the coal miners, and we found that we were in the workshops unknown to each other, saying exactly the same thing, really. And we both saw the future, and I was began to talk to evening classes and night schools all the time, really. I remember sadly I worked closely with Bob Fry at Northern College and Howard Francis at Miners Library in South Wales, both sadly dead now. But and in that time, the miners in Durham began to call me the Prince of Darkness, and given the way I saw the future, and there would be meetings in which minutes referenced me as POD. So they were very good times, really. The amazing thing about the coal miners was no matter how black you painted it, they would still have a laugh, really. And I do miss their presence in British society such a lot. Anyway, after the strike ended, and Ray and I had put together a book called Digging Deeper, we followed the way in which the mines were closed and the incredible way in which they used the redundancy payment scheme to narrow down the choices available to the workers. And at different points, we thought that we would write a comparison between South Wales and Durham over in that period, but it never seemed, my heart was never in it really, because it never seemed to know quite what the end point would be, what was the point of saying it. And in truth, I don't think we would have written the book if it hadn't been for the Brexit referendum, because what the referendum did was many things, but two things to our eyes. One was in the way in which the old coalfields, people on the old coalfields voted to leave. It told us something about what they were thinking and doing. And in the way that their vote was interpreted by the mass media and by intellectuals, told me a lot about what they thought about the working class, which was that basically these people were unthinking, backward, and living in the past. And we thought that some way or another, a book needed to be written or something needed to be said about how these people actually felt and why they felt and did what they did. And at that time, we'd read a book by a US sociologist called Strangers in Their Own Land, which was an attempt to explain why working class people, poor people, had voted for the Tea Party. And while the parallels are not good ones, what she wrote about, which was the need to see, if we were to comment on these situations, is the need to see reality through the eyes of the people and to write about the importance, she says, of life, feeling, and politics. To go away from attitude and opinion polls and to get deep through empathy into the lived experiences of the people you're talking about. And she talked about the need to write deep stories, and we felt that what we could do with regard to the coal miners and their vote was to write not a deep but also a long story, a story about the ways in which these coal mining communities and places had been organized, reorganized, disorganized, and treated by the state, by governments, and by a variety of circumstance over a century. And in this way, I thought we could answer the question which a grandchild of a friend of mine asked recently: what happened to the miners? And it seemed appropriate for us to do this, given that the coal miners, above all the groups of workers within the working class, have a deeply ingrained sense of memory, contributed to by the fact that many of them live in the places where they were born. In South Wales, for example, 80% of the people who live in the valleys were born in the valleys. And so they know their fathers and grandfathers. And we found in research into current trade unionism that trade union activists remember, although they weren't alive at the time of the strike, remember the strikes or the stories that were told. So it's this idea of a long story that we've tried to do in the book. And in this, there are very strong themes of class and gender relations, the theme of trade unions and communities, about political parties, and also about biography. But above all else, it's about the role of the state. And perhaps that's probably the strongest thread that runs through the book. So what we cover, and we're really happy to talk about, is a kind of a labour history which comes up to the present. It's about what does deindustrialization mean when you take away the one industry that has dominated local communities? What happens to the health of the people who live there? What struck us more than anything else, perhaps, was how the levels of ill health in the old coalfield areas, but also the injury that the industry inflicted upon the workers. And one of the deep ironies is after the mines closed, the trade union in its new form took the coal board to court to seek proper compensation. And within all of this, we note the deep resilience and memory of the places. And to quote the title of one of Granville's book, in places like the Durham Miners' Gala, the flame still burns. So is that all right?
Yes, that's lovely. Does Ray want to come in?
He says Yes, he'll speak for himself. Yeah.
Ray, do you want to make your contribution, please?
He's not there.
No?
He's muted.
He's muted. Okay.
Okay, I've unmuted. Yes, that should now be unmuted.
Okay. Ray? Hello, Ray, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Granville. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay,
Do you want to
that's fine.
come in now and add to what Hugh's just said?
Yeah, I just want to. Yeah,
we can't see you.
Unmute your video bit, Ray.
It's automatic.
That's it. You're here. You're all singing and dancing, Ray. Over to you.
I don't know about singing and dancing, Granville, but if you can see and hear me, we'll take that for a start. What I want to do, Hugh, as he said, was brought up in South Wales. I was brought up in Northumberland, really right on the northern fringe of the Great Northern Coalfield, and by an accident of the academic labour market, ended up in Durham in '72, and very quickly became aware of the changes that had taken place in the 6 years that I'd been away in the region and what it looked like in the regional economy. Pits shut, new factories open. The place was changing very, very rapidly. And what was clear to me, even at that point, was the centrality and the significance of the state in this process of transformation. So what I want to do is pick up that theme, and particularly the long-term changes in the character of the state and the way that it is intervened in economy and society. And I want to illustrate that through the specific case of the nationalisation and the subsequent history of the nationalised coal industry. And I suppose at its most general level, what is of interest here is the way in which there's a change in the state from, if you like, an engaged actor in the economy, which has got a concern with providing a decent life for socialised human beings, to picking up an idea from an Italian philosopher called Giorgio Agamben, how it's really just being concerned with what he calls bare life, simply people's biological existence, with no regard to the quality of their life, with no regard to their feelings about their lives, the places they live in and work, and their past and their future. And that's one reason why we thought it was important to try and tell this long story from the inside, and if you like, rather than just the outside. And if we think of what happened with coal and nationalisation, there is a long story there. I mean, it was the aspiration of the miners from, well, a very early stage, that actually the state should become the owner and manager of the industry. And the realisation of that aspiration in '47 led to, as we know, hopes of better wages, secure jobs, more secure futures, better health for the miners. But then you have to contrast that with what happened, and the way in which in the 50s, the maximization of production became the objective above everything else. And once that was no longer necessary, from '58, when a lot of cheap oil became available on the global market, then all of a sudden the state's attitude towards the nationalized industry and the coal industry in particular changed. So 400,000 jobs lost in the 60s from the pits, mass colliery closures, no regard for the implications of this for the miners who lost their jobs, for the pit communities that lost the basis of their livelihood, for the health of miners who were ejected from the industry. And there seemed to be a short interlude in the '70s. And then, of course, Thatcher arrived on the scene. And contrary to what Boris Johnson seems to believe, she wasn't closing pits for environmental reasons. She was actually closing pits because she wanted to destroy the NUM. Because if she could destroy the NUM, then trade unionism as a social force in general would be weakened and have its base eroded and so on. So that political attack in that sense, which led then up to privatization and the ultimate closure of all the industry, really left the coalfields by 2008-9, when the big financial recession kicked in a very, very weak position, because contrary to what I think a lot of people had believed, the election of a Labour government in '97, with a strong historic ties between Labour and the coal industry and so on, the NUM, didn't lead to a policy of constructive regeneration of the coalfield economies with new well-paid jobs and so on. That may have been the discourse of regeneration, but it was a long, long way from what happened. And by the time you got to the austerity politics of the second decade of this century, then the conditions of the former coalfields and the lives of people there had really become very bare. And it's at that point that I think I stopped the story, because that's the lead in to what Hugh was talking about, the way in which this served as a trigger to a big political response, which initially was a rejection, not so much of the European Union, but of the views of established political elites. If they were for it, then we're against it. And then, of course, through to the 2019 election, which gave us the prospect of Johnson as Prime Minister, with all that was going to mean for the former coalfield communities. So I'll stop it at that point, Granville. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ray. I'm going to move on to Jean now. Jean Spence. Jean and Carol Stevenson have worked very closely together over the years. Jean is based in Seaham in County Durham, and she wrote to me briefly this morning. She lived in the shadow of three mines, Seaham, Dordon and Vane Tempest. And indeed, in '93, Jean was actively involved in the Vane Tempest pit camp, and she's written a very good book called a pamphlet rather called The Vigil about it. But both Jean and Carol have written extensively about issues to do with coal mining communities, and of course the impact not just in the coal mining community, but in the northeast, of course, the decline of shipbuilding and other industries that were key to the economies of that area. So Carol can't be with Jean today because Carol's father-in-law, there's a ceremony delayed in the Shetlands, which Carol has to be at. But both Carol and Jean, I'm really pleased that they've been involved. They wrote a chapter in Shafted, the book we did for the 35th anniversary of the strike, which is called It Has to Be a Miner's Wife. And I thought it was a very revelatory chapter about attitudes and assumptions about what mining communities and coal mining families were about. So over to you, Jean, please.
Okay, thank you. The collaboration between Carol and I started at the event that she was involved in organising at Northumbria, which was to talk about the 20-year anniversary of the strike. So it must have been 2005. We've been working together since then, and we had a group of women who came along who'd been involved in the strike then, who wanted to review their own trajectories and what had happened to them since the strike and the effect of the strike upon them. And amongst them was Anne Suddick, who unfortunately died in January. And Anne and I talked quite a lot, and Anne was quite influential in really making me feel that it was okay, it was okay to write about this history, which was my own personal history, because previously I tried to avoid it quite a lot. And I've got lots of ambiguous feelings about coal mining, having been brought up in a mining family and having experienced my father's suffering. I can't say it was anything other than suffering from his work in the mine. And I mean, to talk about the shadow of the mine, I felt like we were completely and totally overshadowed. Every day of my life until the age of 18 was overshadowed by the mine until I escaped. And escape was the word I wanted to use. I came back later because fundamentally I couldn't really get away from it. And I tried to avoid it. I tried to avoid the strike and I couldn't really. But in 1993, I just decided I'm going to try to come to terms with this, and I'm going to try to confront these ambiguities and tensions and contradictions. And I'm telling you all this because I think it's those ambiguities and tensions and contradictions and those experiences of pain that I suffered on behalf of my father, who died in 1980, probably fortunately in relation to how he would have felt about the strike, I don't know. I'm telling you this because that has actually impacted on all of the work that we've done, that Carol and I have done. And her experience being brought up in a steelworkers factory in Concert has also impacted on the work that we have done. And we've said a lot of things which made us realise that it's not just about the mines and shipbuildings, it's much broader, and there are much broader issues of gender in there. So in reviewing, we've been having a look at what we've written over the years, and we noticed that there's a strong tendency to try to debunk any romanticism around mining. I think we both felt that, especially in relation to the women's involvement in the strike, there was a lot of romanticism, and all that stuff about miners' wives was part of that romanticism, which didn't actually deal with the complexity of the relationships between men and women. A lot of what's been written about women in the strike has been written coherently, it's been well written, it's been good, but there's something about the women's role in the private sphere which isn't actually present. And so what we've tried to do is dig into our perceptions as women, experiencing growing up in these sorts of families and experiencing living and continuing to live in these environments, to actually inform the questions we've asked and the work that we've done. So our takeoff point was the 1984-85 strike, but that's not really what our work is about. I think it's about trying to understand something deeper, something that Hugh was saying about a sort of deep history or something deeper about what's been going on. Obviously, in mining life, just to talk about the centrality of the pit was at the centre of everything. It was the centre of everything as I was growing up and everything that anybody did. Even if your family didn't work in the pit governed everything. And I always thought of it as the beating heart of life, as it were. That's what the pit was. And everybody and every family lived in its shadow. But women also lived in the shadow of the men. And even if those women were working, and a lot of them were working and had their own part-time jobs, even then, and they had a whole story about that, they lived in the shadow of the men in their families and the men who worked in the pits. And this living in the shadow is a sort of private experience. It's an experience in the private domain. But the story of the women isn't only about the story of women as they're associated with the pit in public life. It's the story of the women as they're associated with the pit in personal life and private life, and in the neighbourhoods where informal association went on, as much as in the institutions which were associated with mining life. So in these terms, in terms of the private, it feels like it's less easy to create a coherent narrative than it is to talk about men and mining. And the exception to this, of course, is the strike. So when the women came into the public arena during the strike, then it's possible to develop a coherent narrative about that. So it's acknowledged that in mining history, women's primary role has primarily being to support the men, to manage the family and housework and household, and to deal with family and neighbourhood concerns. And I think when I was thinking about this, I'm thinking what that's created is a female dynamic, a female-centered dynamic that didn't manifest itself as central to public institutions associated with mining life. Women were sort of marginal to those institutions, or they took roles that were associated with their domestic role. But this female dynamic created particular skills and particular ways of communicating, and there was a whole woman's world. Just as there was a man's world down the pit, there was a woman's world too. So it involved things like tacit understanding between women. They didn't even demand to be verbalized. They understood each other and where they were coming from. It included shared anxieties about the nature of work in the pit and what the men had to endure. It involved concern for and loyalty for the men. And at the same time, it worked to maintain and reproduce conditions of respectability and a certain type of social order. It worked to ameliorate the dirt of working in the mines. And it also worked to try to overcome the humiliations and also the unconstrained masculinity of the pit. It included things like the arts of subterfuge that were shared amongst women to help them manage the excessive physical and financial power of the men. And it involved control of sexual mores and morals. And the women communicated all this through family and neighborhood networks. And this was the basis of their informal and largely ad hoc social organization when neighborhood and family issues needed to be addressed. And the last thing, which seems to have become more important recently, we did some work with Jeff Bright, who was interested in the notion of social haunting. And in response to that, it was a lot of women who came out with social and family memories, and made me think about the centrality of memory and intergenerational learning and recollection that women seem to carry with them outside the pit, different from the pit stories, but a whole other area that is important. I think Hugh and Ray have done a great job to pointing to the consequences of the sexual division of labour in mining life and the active role that women played in mining history. But the area that Carol and I have tried to understand is something which I think is a little bit additional to that and has implications for what's happened since the pits closed. How am I doing for time, Granville?
You're all right.
Am I okay? Okay. I think what in particular Carol and I have been aware of is moments of role playing and silences from women operating in the public sphere, which we construe as the world of men. And to speak from a female point of view has often involved courting the danger of being unheard or dismissed or denigrated or accused of betraying our class. And I think the 1984 to 85 strike broke that quite a lot, because the women found themselves able to talk from that perspective. But only a minority of women were actually engaged in the strike at this level. And there's a whole sort of underbelly of stuff that was going on in the mining communities where women were keeping things going, which wasn't really publicly available for people to understand in terms of what happened through the strike. We think this is important because in the years since the strike and since the closures of the mines, women have played as you recognise in the book, women have played an increasingly important part in maintaining not only families and neighbourhood, but against the odds of impoverishment and decline and humiliation, in helping to try to develop some sort of positive responses within civil society. There's a quote in the book from Malcolm Fallow, who's the chief executive of East Durham Trust, and he says, and he refers to the strike here, but he says, it's amazing how many female activists there are in East Durham who are now parish councillors, school governors, community centre managers, and women who are empowered in their own communities. I think Malcolm is reiterating here what is common knowledge about the role of women in the strike. But what Carol and I want to suggest is the strike gave the women the space, an opportunity to put into the public sphere and put into practice in the public sphere what they'd already always done in the private sphere, and that's to deal with crises and to organise and to manage in response to situations as they emerge without the benefit of public institutions and organisations. The strike took them further than they would have gone, and what's happened since the strike is the women, as the men's institutions and organisations have disintegrated or lost funding or lost support, the women have become increasingly active in the public sphere, in civil society, and they have, I would say, I think they've taken control in so many situations, and in doing so, what they have been using is the skills that they learned in the private sphere, and they've transferred that into the community sphere. So the women, the significance of women as community activists today is not only about their role in this strike, but it's based on that female dynamic, which is consequent upon their historic role in family and neighbourhood. And if I can just give some personal examples, I taught on a community and youth work course in the early 1980s, and it was really startling to see the way in which that course changed from a predominantly male course to a predominantly female course in terms of the intake. And in 1994, I took photographs when the washery was being demolished, and it was women who were present to watch the demolition of Van Tempest, not the men. And through the 1990s, I watched the women take low-paid jobs as carers and start to try to build new organisations and new types of community activism, while the men were sort of walking dogs with buggies attached to them. And I saw the women trying to deal with the fallout from the closure of pits, the suicides, the drug-related issues, all those sorts of things. At present, as part of EDAN, what I've noticed is that the men don't seem to have the basis anymore for managing the organisations in the way that they used to when the pits were alive. So the women had taken the role of managing these organisations. But the important thing in relation to the politics of the situation is quite often this is done in an ad hoc way, without any political ideology, without any particular political commitment, and without any direct links to the trade union and the labour movement. And there doesn't seem to have been any way in which the labour movement has managed to work alongside women in these sorts of environments in the way that is women-centred, that would enable that sort of education that the women can transfer to be just to be heard and in the local community setting. So what I've witnessed is a decline in explicit politics and a growth in community politics, and an inability of the labour movement to really take advantage of that. I'll stop there, Granville, because I know I'm taking a lot of time.
Thanks very much for that very useful perspective. Very good. I just should mention that Jean mentioned Eden. That's the East Durham Artists.
Sorry, did I? Yeah.
And I found it incredible. I spoke at a meeting that Jean organised there. It's a grouping of people who use art to express responses to issues in their daily life. And at the moment, there's a really good exhibition there. A hedge, a venerable hedge that's been there for centuries. A developer decided to chop it down, and the people around Eden got involved, protested, and there's a wonderful exhibition on at the moment in the art block where the Eden operates from. But I think it's a very powerful example of what you're describing, Jean, that response of the way women within the community come together to produce a very powerful and relevant initiative.
Yes, the women organised that, but if they had been explicitly saying that they were coming from the labour movement in any way at all, we would not have got the support that we did for that. So the issue is about trying to mobilise the support that's there and available in a way which is sort of socialist or left wing, without alienating people who have been alienated by formal politics, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you for that. Lots of issues there. Now, the fourth speaker is Nick Jones. Nick, you may have seen him recently. Channel 5 did a documentary on the miners' strike, and Nick featured quite a lot in there, but it reminded us, of course, that it's not just Boris Johnson that can make comments that highlight the issues to do with mining, but the whole issue of the mining industry, centrality in British politics and cultural life and activity, I think was brought out very clearly in the way in which this film, this documentary, again, showed relevance. One had criticisms of it, but I'm going to let Nick talk a little bit, and then we can open it up to questions and discussion. Nick, over to you.
Good, thank you, Granville. Well, first of all, to congratulate Hugh and Ray on the way they track back and we begin to see what the devastation in South Wales and in Durham led to. And we get that real understanding, don't we, of the desolation in the mining communities and how the disenfranchised hit back, as they say in the book, a sort of peasants' revolt. And of course, we've just heard from Jean about how so many women in the mining communities were energized and have moved on and upwards in public life. Now, as Boris Johnson is discovering, as Granville said in his introduction, dealing with the mining communities is a bit of a two-edged sword. Yes, he benefited from the protest vote and the kicking against the establishment over Brexit, but it's going to be, in my opinion, a very different story when it comes to this cock and bull line about thanking Margaret Thatcher for closing the pits because it's given the UK this early start, as he described it, on greening. Now, what a difference between Boris and John Major. Now, we have to remember when Major visited South Shields in 2008, he acknowledged that rushing through the 31 pit closures in 1992 that Granville referred to hasten privatization was the biggest single misjudgment of his premiership. Those were his words. He said his government had been wrong to think that £1 billion in redundancy payments for 30,000 redundant miners had been the right policy. And as Hugh describes, that narrowed the choices for the men who were being made redundant because they had no alternative but to take the money. And what Major faced, I think, so fairly was, he said it was his failure to pump in sufficient money into the areas like the Northeast to speed up regeneration. Now, I'm always fascinated by the way our perspective of the strike keeps on getting refreshed from unexpected quarters and how we get new insights and we get new perspectives. Now, as Granville's already mentioned, the Channel 5 film, Mrs. Thatcher versus the Miners, and I quite agree that it had sort of mixed reviews among some people. It went out in June. I can fill in a little of the background. I was interviewed along with others as a veteran reporter of the strike. Paul Routledge was also interviewed as well, formerly of the Times and the Mirror. And the technique with these Channel 5 documentaries is you pull together as many talking heads as you possibly can. You prepare a list of questions which are the same for all of them, so that you cover the same subjects. And then you splice together the sort of most interesting snippets from their interviews. And then you, of course, construct a storyline which will go along with the archive footage. Now, Turn TV, the production company, and I had quite a few conversations with the editor, and he admitted to me that they'd started out on this documentary. Channel 5 had commissioned it, and they are commissioning quite a few contemporary documentaries like that. And he said it was a bit of a fishing trip. We didn't really know where we were going to go with the film, but we've got all these questions which we thought were important. And of course, they give you a real session. I mean, I spent 2 hours being interviewed by them in the morning, and Neil Kinnock was spending 2 hours that afternoon. So you can see they cover a mountain of material. Anyway, what so interested me, he said it wasn't the interviews that had changed the direction of the programme, but the visceral hatred that they still found in the mining communities for what Mrs. Thatcher had done. Now, in my interview, I went to great lengths to explain all that we discovered. That's through the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, and we've written about it in many of our books, because we looked, and I've looked and spent many hours looking at Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet records, and what they explain is how she micromanaged the dispute, how she was such a force behind the scenes in mobilizing the police, because her instructions, you see, about stopping the flying pickets, for example, they were acted on within days by the police when they began to monitor the motorways and stop the movement of pickets up and down the country. Now, again, a fascinating insight for me. When Channel 5 pulled together this, they commissioned a lot of footage, as all the footage that they could get from the various archive libraries. These are maintained by someone called Getty Images, by the BBC, by the ITV. And what the film pulled together was unseen footage from police control rooms and from behind the police lines. Cameras, these were shots taken by the police themselves. Now, Turn TV said that this trawl had produced some really highly revealing shots. There they are in the archives, but they hadn't been pulled together and they hadn't been explained. And they show, of course, precisely how Mrs. Thatcher managed to orchestrate what was an unprecedented mobilization of the police. Now, that footage, much of it was new to me, and it portrayed in much greater impact anything that I could possibly say or write. And we went to great length in some of Granville's books to try and describe what Mrs. Thatcher had been up to. But once you saw those images, you understood how the police were acting under instructions and directions. So, just as we've seen with Hugh and Ray's book, and we've just heard now from Jean, I think we've got so much more to learn about the conduct and the fallout from the strike. And as I say, I'm always amazed by the questions that we get asked and the students who are picking over this whole moment in British history, and they bounce off questions that really surprise me looking back, and they're a real challenge. So, Granville, I hope we're managing to provoke some thoughtful questions this afternoon.
Thanks ever so much, Nick. Yeah, can I urge people, if you want to fire questions, please use the chat, and let's just start. There's one here from Barry White. Let's start with this one. His question is, how significant was the failure of the Blair-Brown government to regenerate mining communities, contributing to the decline of support for Labour in these communities? Can we field that one initially to Hugh and Ray, please?
Yeah, okay, Granville, I'll kick it off. I mean, as I said, I think the realization that actually the transition from Thatcher to Blair was no transition at all. That if anything, the economic policies that were pursued under Blair and Brown were simply a continuation and in some ways a deepening of the Thatcherite policies that had been introduced in the 80s, with no regard whatsoever for the specific cases and the problems of the former coal mining communities. Yes, there was the commission of inquiry, but actually it led to very little in substantive terms. And insofar as there were jobs on the coal fields, they tended to be poorly paid, certainly much more less well paid than the jobs in the mines had been. A lot of them were in low-level services, or very routine manufacturing, and I think the feeling was that things weren't going to be any different. It's going to be a continuation of what had gone before, and I think if you look at the way in which the support for Labour declined from the peak of '97, there's a very clear pathway through there, And I think it very much related to the fact that there's an understanding that actually, as far as New Labour was concerned, former coalfields weren't really on its agenda.
Hugh, do you want to come in at all?
No, save to endorse that. There was the idea that Blairism was Thatcher light or Thatcher plus community, but if in relation to the economic policies, it was still overwhelmingly based upon the markets, attracting international capital. And it's the question that I think Neil asks below, that what was we write about as being quite disturbing, really, is that you have a situation with this, if with the strike, say, or with the National Union of Mine Workers, when places like Durham and South Wales were, although perhaps singing with a slightly different tone, all to the same hymn sheet, really. But once you turn away the mines, you find that they start competing with each other for the same jobs. And some of the ways in which we've recorded local authority people talking about their role has been quite disturbing, about how we have to compete and we can compete with them better than they can compete with us, and so on. And I remember I was in Durham one morning. I stayed over, must have been the Gale, I think, and the local press had a notification that the ashes test had gone to Cardiff, and there was outrage in the Echo about the Chronicle about don't they realise that we've got pits up here as well? So there was, rather than have any sort of coherent sort of levelling, refusing to undercut each other, we have this kind of ongoing fiscal warfare, really. We can give you more than they can. I think Neil's idea of local authorities looking to community wealth building as a way of building up local resources rather than competing with each other for jobs that rarely stay is a really important point, really.
Yeah, Neil, this is of course what Preston is doing. He's trying to see ways in which it can organise and keep activity local rather than having companies coming and then disappear. Neil, do you want to comment on this at all? Can we unmute Neil? Neil, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, that that's the sort of the main point. I mean, I live in Sheffield now, and which is obviously near to local the Yorkshire coalfields, and all the local authorities are playing that game that Hugh's on about there. I mean, I just give one example, and that's ASOS, the big sort of fashion place. I mean, they've got a on the site of Granthorpe Colliery, they've got this great big warehouse that they're, similar to what Amazon and all that lot people have. And the Barnsley Council think it's wonderful. And when my brother used to work for Coalfield Communities Campaign, he remembers going to, I was talking to him about this yesterday, and he said, when he went to talk, when they were talking to people involved in trying to get people jobs in Barnsley, the people who were working for these firms would say, you could get a job at ASOS, but I won't get a job at ASOS to me dog. And yet the council, were praising this thing because, in a sense, it was the only thing they got, and they seem to think, well, that's how you have to do it. And what particularly Labour authorities have not really. Not enough on them are taking up them idea, the community wealth building ideas. They're still stuck in the you might call the failed ways of the last 30 years.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Thanks for that. There was a question that linking to Grimethorpe. I'm just going to go up. This is from Philip Watson. Now you've fired a lot of questions here, Philip, but I want to just. There was one issue. The third question you put, the closure of Grimethorpe Power Station. I think it was the fluidized bed combustion. This links in with Thatcher and Johnson's comments. Grimethorpe. Right, Philip? Question for you. Okay, over to you. Can you unmute, Philip? Can we unmute Philip?
I'm doing it. I'm doing it. I've done it now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I'm 68 now. I never worked in the coal industry. I worked in the associated industries like Walter Halls, for instance. But most of my relatives and close friends worked in the mines. And I remember during the strike, I was actually prevented from going to work on many, many occasions by the police. Where you going? Where do you work? Go home, or we'll arrest you. And the questions I put in the chat regarding the CISWO, Coal Industry Welfare Organisation, and the Mine Workers Pension Fund, the government have no intentions of releasing that money, that surplus. But regarding the fluidised bed at Grimethorpe, which has disappeared, it was the most efficient way of combusting coal known to mankind. I do recall when I worked at Barnsley at Walters, we did some work on the fluidised, not me personally, but we did some work on the fluidised bed power station. And I remember these German engineers coming to our works in Barnsley. And these engineers come to see what I was doing. I put compressed air valves, pneumatic valves together, among other things. And these German engineers said to me at the time, the fluidised bed system at Grimethorpe was absolutely wonderful, efficient, clean, environmentally friendly, and economic way of combusting coal. And we've lost it for good.
Yeah.
So everyone knows Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservatives just wanted to destroy the coal industry, and then they could destroy the working classes and reduce us to slaves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just one quick point on the Grimethorpe fluidisation. When the pits were privatised, the actual plant was dynamited. It was it was blown up. It wasn't just demolished, it was dynamited. And all the technology and skills and all of that research went with it. So it was an act of vandalism. Okay, let's have a look. See.
Right. Can I say something?
Yes,
Do you want to? Well, it's the case that when we look at the coal industry, as Philip asking the question, all our attention is paid to the closure of the mines, which is, of course, very, very important. But they forget about the research base that the coal industry had at Stoke Orchard and at Bretby, and that's Johnson's joke up in Scotland was a way of diverting attention from the question rather than any sensible question. But the fact is that the coal industry was very, very concerned about developing clean coal technologies through the 70s and the 80s, and they, with regard to controlling sulfur, controlling chlorine, the idea of methane capture, all these things that were being developed in those big institutions, and they were all completely wiped out. And it is quite tragic, actually, the whole kind of potential, the huge amount of research knowledge that was contained in those establishments, and the potential that it had for actually maintaining the coal industry. In fact, there was a document written by the head of Stoke Orchard which I've often wondered about, actually, in 1973, which argued that the best way of getting petroleum was from coal, and that the future of the coal industry could be through a chemical feedstock and producing petroleum, which I think would have shaken up the Shell and BP quite a lot, actually. And you know that the chief executives of Shell and BP were on the Conservatives policy committee during the strike. So it was they were up against the miners' union, and they were also up against the coal industry, actually.
Yeah,
So
I mean that was the coal for oil project, and that was based up at the Point of Ayre colliery. That was one of the casualties, along with the fluidized bed. And what I think was so tragic was the loss of them. And then when you spool on to 1992, and you get the 31 pit closures that Heseltine pushed through under John Major after the Conservatives won the 92 general election, you see British Coal made this appeal to get more investment. Would the government agree to investment in a new power station, which could have used some of these up-to-date processes? But of course, Heseltine refused. And as we know, the government went for the dash for gas, the use of gas to generate electricity, gas-fired power stations. And of course, when Labour came in 1997, the die was cast. And I think that was the great failure. I mean, I think that Labour should have done more to help other regeneration in the coal fields, but when it came to the coal industry, I think everyone within the industry accepted that once the closure announcement was given for those 32, that had meant that the days of using coal for power generation, we were on the countdown. And we've seen, haven't we, just the last week, was it, that the last couple of or 2 more cooling towers have gone, so that that chapter is closing very, very quickly.
Thank you, Nick. I'm just looking again. There doesn't seem to be many questions coming up here. There are 1 or 2 comments. I'm going to throw this one at you, Nick.
Yep.
This is from Paul Topley. He's saying, the role of Thatcher and the police was described at the time. Media journalists ignored it because it didn't suit their narrative. Now, Nick, you covered the miners' strike, 84-85. Respond to that.
Well, I mean, you're quite right. I don't think the mass media as a whole was looking at it other than through the lens of Mrs. Thatcher taking on the miners and using the police to support the rule of law. I noted your comments. I mean, I think the importance of what I was trying to the importance or the significance of what I was trying to get across about the film was that, you see, we didn't know a lot about the way that this was being orchestrated. I mean, this is like journalists like myself and the BBC. We knew that it was being orchestrated, but we didn't know the hows and the whys and the wherefores. And what's so fascinating to me about the film is that you see these police control rooms getting information, and the telephonists are picking up information and they're answering calls, telling them where the pickets are coming and going and this, that, and the other. And I think it was that intelligence gathering. Now, this is an area where we don't know very much still. And of course, if you look in the cabinet records, all the references to what the intelligence services were doing, which is monitoring phone calls and telephone tapping, there is all those records are still closed. So when I said I'm always amazed by the perspectives, the fresh perspectives that are coming, I hadn't seen before footage of actual police control rooms and the degree of information that they were getting. And that's another chapter, Granville, for one of our books, when eventually we hope the cabinet records might reveal what degree of intelligence, what was the role of the intelligence services in the strike and gathering information. Now that would be another fascinating area for our work, if we can ever get there.
Yeah. Okay. The question here for Jean. It's from Vicky Seddon. The question for Jean: recurrent public activity by women. How has that impacted on their private family life?
Oh, right. Well, I think that the women are still central within ex-mining families, and I think they still continue with a lot of the same tacit knowledge and power, but they have a lot more control over their own lives in an interpersonal sense. I mean, it's hard for me to speak about families in general, because obviously it's just about my experience of and who I know. But my understanding is that the women have a lot more personal control, and of course their role in earning a wage has given them a lot more control, and that wage has been much more important. As far as the community activity is concerned, the way in which women tend to construe community activity involves children and includes understanding of family responsibilities. And so it's really not as exclusionary. And I say that in relation to community organisations that women run, which was apparent when women used to run women's conferences and feminist organisations, when they used to run their own creches and that sort of thing. It's harder in relation to the more professional organisations, where you have things like health and safety rules around creches and childcare and all that sort of thing. So I think, well, how do I say it? There's more stress too, in terms of the levels of responsibility that women have. So there's no way in which most women now would be able to say that they could take responsibility for the home and only for the home. And I think that yes, the major impact might be in terms of their lives, might be more stress, more responsibility taken. But on the other hand, there's a sort of empowerment alongside that.
Thanks, Jean. The question again from Neil Parry. Do you think that if the NUM had kept the branches going as unemployed branches, maintaining community capacity to better influence local authority and government, and not just walking the dog like Jean noted? So I think that's one for Hugh and Ray first, and maybe Jean wants to come in on it as well. Okay, Hugh?
Well, Neil knows my view. This was, of course, a resolution to the NUM National Conference, forget when, 87, perhaps 88. And Arthur Sclager was quite opposed to it, as I recall. And there had been other attempts at unemployed branches in the T&G in Liverpool, which was marginally successful for a while after the Speak factory closed. I think it would have been very important to have done that. Of course, some of the lodges have kept going in different ways, particularly around the issues of compensation. But I think, and we write in Durham about how, in order to get away from the dogs, they've got this men's shed activity where places for men to meet. I think this is what the idea of an unemployed branch covers, really, is the need for some kind of loose organizational form to bring together people who are out of work and in a position to argue for support and the support to help the conditions of people who are unemployed. So it would have been a very, very, very good thing to have done, but it failed, and we are where we are.
Okay, Ray, do you want to come in on that?
No, I don't think there's anything I want to add to that. I just go along with what Hugh said there.
Yeah. Jean, would you think that would have been?
Yes, I think it could have been important. I think that people still look to the NUM for sort of advice about employment matters and formal matters, and you know, I mean, my mother, who was widowed at the time, I remember her getting letters about looking for compensation and things like that, and going to the man who had been the lodge secretary for that sort of formal advice. I think what they left with was a sort of lacuna in that area, and the community projects in themselves weren't enough to deal with the issues that were being raised. It would have been nice to have seen them carry on and to make partnerships with the community groups that were organising on a more ad hoc and local level. But as Hugh says, it wasn't to be.
Right, thank you. Paul, I think this may have covered the question you were asking there. The support group movement was arguably the biggest social movement since the general strike. What impact did that have, and what legacy do you think the strike has left in terms of class consciousness or consciousness of the role of the state? I mean, if I can just mention, in the mining village in Upton, I did interviews with people who were very active during the strike. And there was a significant group of women who quite played a role, just not just locally in the women's support group, but organising feeding in the village, but also going to speak internationally. And they have retreated. So I think it's a good question. I mean, there was an amazing amount of solidarity during the strike, but post the strike, those sort of support groups, what's happened to them? Hugh, do you want to come in on that?
Well, as Gina said, and I think a lot of the things that Gina said are very, very interesting, because we say that a thread through our book has to do with the gender division of labour, and that is probably the most fundamental transformation that's taken place alongside the loss of employment. And in relation to the support groups, it's as we know that there was about perhaps 5% of women women from mining families who became actively involved in those groups. And we know that many of them have been slightly active in some political way before. And we know from the quote that Jean has already given that a lot of them carried on being active in different ways and in the various organizations. And one of but alongside the increasing role that women are playing within the formal economy and public life. And we quote one ex-deputy in Mountain Ash saying, it used to be the lodge that runs the place, now it's the women. And I used to tell people what to do, now they tell me what to do. So there's a real, well, we laughed too, of course, but there's a real kind of tension there, but also a real kind of sign of quite significant social change. And I think we done a little project in Cardiff and shown that a sample of trade union activists, asking them why did they become active in the union, and 70% of them mentioned the miners' strike as a reason. And I think it's and you've written, Granville, about the strike in Yorkshire, haven't you, whereby the experience of the miners' strike influenced the way the strike was organized and so on. I think it is part of that deep story. It is. I talked to a man who was a hairdresser in Nick's old town, who comes from Ebbw Vale, and I said to him, "How are things in Ebbw Vale?" And he said, "There's no jobs." Like he said, Thatcher took all the jobs, but we had a good party when she died. And I think there's a real ongoing remembrance of it all, really, and it's a member of both the industry and the struggle to save it. And some people say that, if there hadn't been a strike, they might have saved some of the pits and it might have gone on a bit longer. Some people say that. But several people have said to me, one in particular, that if it hadn't been for the strike, we wouldn't have these such powerful memories of the industry, memories of what we were and what we tried to do. And I think that's true. And so it's
yeah, good point. Good points there.
Can I just say something there, Granville? Yeah. When we had an exhibition which was based on the work of our little mining art group, which again comprised mainly women, even though it was a man who organises. We had a little mining art group, and we produced lots of work which was related to mining, which we displayed in the art block, which we run in Seams, just a little voluntary run gallery. And we had more people come in to see that exhibition than any other exhibition that we've ever run. But the interesting thing about it was that the memories were long. We had lots of people just using that space to speak informally about their memories of mining, and the strike is always present, but it wasn't just about the strike. It was about the long memories of hurt and illness and the accidents in particular that happened to people, which were being carried down. And people used the occasion, really, I think, just to reiterate something about who they were and who they knew they were. So yeah. The strike was important. The strike provoked that, but it's longer.
Good, thanks. A good point there. There's a question here, while you're still there, it's from Caroline Bedale, and it's addressed to Eugene. It's quite a long question, but essentially, Caroline says she was very active working in the NHS, organising there. What is it different within mining communities compared with other places and industries? Can you see the question, Jean?
No, I can't actually see it. Is organising within mining different
Well,
from?
let me ask Caroline if she'd like to come in. Caroline?
Yeah, sorry, it was a bit long. It was just, I think you said, unless I misunderstood you, I think you said that the women organising was very much within the communities,
Yes.
both before and after the strike,
Yes.
rather than within the labour movement.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned something about the art group, that they couldn't actually say it was to do with the labour movement because they wouldn't have got the support. And I didn't fully understand that, whether you were meaning that there was something different within mining communities and how organised with other places. And I was just giving my example of the NHS, where obviously there's a lot of women organising and active there. So I didn't know if you meant that living under the shadow of the pit actually meant that women did organise and still do differently in those areas.
No, I think what the women did was complementary to the pit and complementary to what the NUM did and the mining did. My point about not mentioning the labour movement is that I have encountered visceral hatred of the labour movement. It's quite shocking, actually, the extent to which people, lots of people, actually hate the Labour Party and anything to do with the unions, which seems to me to be connected with, this relates back to the question about New Labour, seems to me to be connected very much with the way in which people experience a huge letdown from New Labour, which made them cynical about the possibility of any party ever doing anything for them in any terms. And so organising at the level of community, even though I think community I don't mean community organisation in the sense in which they mean in the States. I mean community organisation as informal education, as informal association, should involve and does involve a political perspective. If that political perspective is explicitly tied to a party, and particularly the Labour Party, then it is problematic for a lot of people who would otherwise get involved because of this this feeling of anger. And I mean, we've already talked about the anger towards Thatcher and the Tories, which continues. That's hatred of Labour hasn't displaced that, but the feeling that Labour politics, Labour politicians, Labour local councils and the unions haven't delivered anything for people is, I think, very strong.
Thanks, Jean. Now, normally when we run events at Wortley Hall, we run for an hour. Now, we've run over a bit, but I just wanted to go back to one of the controversial points about the book, which I think we've skirted around a bit, which is that the argument, the charge that the red wall seats that fell that went to the Tories, this was about a disillusionment with historically the failure of the state, the failure of governments to actually try to think strategically about the mining industry. But I'd like just to get comments from the four speakers about how they see, what they think in a little bit more detail. What was the reason for the shift in these seats? What were the reasons why voters, for example, in Wakefield, voted completely for a Conservative, decades has been a Labour MP, Conservative MP in Wakefield, and of course in the Northeast and in other industrial heartlands. So I do think this is a crucial thing. Are these votes and support for Labour lost, or is Labour itself failing? So this is I suppose a controversial way to try and end the meeting. Where do we go now? What is the prospect in these former red wall seats of people either shifting back to Labour, or is there going to be a new political formation? What's going to happen? So let's start with the running order we had. Let's start with Hugh first.
Well, I suppose the answer is I don't know really. I think we have to take really seriously what Jean has said and what we found in our book. The way in which people in Blaenau Gwent talked about the Labour Party and so on and so forth. So and that what we try to do is place in a context of what is basically a declining support for the Labour Party within the working class since 1966. And I often talk about what happened between in Wales. The Labour vote dropped by 10% between 1966 and 1970. And you ask the question, what happened in those 4 years? Well, they closed an awful lot of collieries, and there was also the disaster at Aberfan that was compounded by first of all, the failure of Robbins to visit, except for 48 hours afterwards, because he was being enrolled as Chancellor of the University of Surrey. And then when the tip had to be removed, the Labour government supporting the NCB and saying that it couldn't be paid for by them. And the Labour minister, who became Lord Tonopandi, taking the money illegally from the support fund that had been collected for the people. So they were quite damaging effects. We see that as the point when nationalisation lost its sheen, really, and along with it, a lot to do with the Labour Party. And it drops again until it comes up with the Blair election, but his vote drops enormously until when you get Brown's election, the vote is below 40% in the north, and it's this long-term decline which we see as a long-term process of disillusionment and hurt, really. And one of the questions that someone's asked is about the miners' pension fund, and you all know the detail of that. Was that when it was privatized, the major government said that they would underpin it, but they would take 50% of the profit. And when the Labour government came in under Blair, they had an investigation and said that there was no actuarial basis for keeping that 50-50 split, and that an 80-20 split would be preferable, and that was not implemented. And the same things happen now with people. The mining industry is an amazing industry because people remember every bloody thing. Everybody. So when one of our parts of our fieldwork was saying, when we talked to people about regeneration, he said we're the only bloody industry that's having to pay for our own regeneration, because all the compensation they were getting was coming out of what was taken out of the pension fund. And so there is, I think, a deep disillusionment with it all, really. And I'm not one to give anyone advice, but my strong feeling is that we need to organise outside the Labour Party and organise alongside the ways that Jean's been talking about it, but more generally with partly within the unions as well, and try to get some way of recomposing a sense of power and worth within the daily life of working people, really. And I remember when the Blair government came in, one of his ministers who I knew said to me, we didn't realise how bad things were. And I think a lot of people still don't realise how bad things are. They really don't understand how people manage to live. And one of the tragic things we write about in parts of the book is how a lot of people have lost any sense of self-worth. They feel that they are worth less, and in that context can't care for themselves, let alone anyone else. And it produces huge levels of problems which needs to be looked at and dealt with. And so at the moment, I'm not surprised by where the vote is going. Maybe it can be resurrected, but I think it's going to take to rebuild. So when you hear community organisers saying you can't mention the Labour Party or you get such anger, you have to hesitate when you use the word Labour movement, really. But if we're going to try to rebuild the Labour movement, I think I'm not going to be here that long, but it's a long haul, really. I think a long haul of building it up. We quote someone in the book as saying it's got to start again from the bottom, really. And I really do think that's what has to happen.
Okay, I just see, just before I ask Ray to come in, I see here Scott Dart. Do you see any parallels between the COVID mutual aid groups and the mutual aid during the strike? Any cause for optimism that the spirit is still there? Okay, Ray, over to you.
Thanks, Granville. I don't think I wanted to add anything really to what Hugh said, because I agree with it. But I think what it did again has emphasised the importance of taking the long view on this. That this wasn't sort of a sudden decline in support for Labour. It's something that you can trace back over decades, and I think any question about building back better would have to recognise that there, if you like, it was a long process of decline. It would be a long process of rebuilding something else, and I think it would be something that had to be rebuilt from the bottom, which would raise the sort of issue that Raymond Williams talked about years ago, about how do you combine militant particularisms into a broader political movement. I think the only thing I'll add in the shorter term is that I think it's by no means guaranteed that the Conservatives will hang on to all those seats they won in 2019, but it doesn't follow from that they'll go back to Labour.
Good points there, both you and Ray. Thank you. Jean?
Yes, I agree with all those comments. I think there has been a disconnect between the Labour movement and the issues that concern people in their everyday lives. I don't think that this necessarily means that people have become more right-wing or less collective. I think that the Labour Party in particular, as it's represented in local government, appears to people to be more interested in itself as its own organisation and in the futures and the careers of the people who adhere to it than it is interested. And even when that's not true, that's how it appears to be. And people are really trying to deal with things that are happening to them in their everyday lives in ways that don't seem to figure anywhere in political discourse, formal political discourse. And so it's the disconnect that worries me, and it's the absence of any sensitivity to what you need to do in terms of political discussion to generate debate and discussion which doesn't lead to polarisation. I don't think people are Conservatives. I don't think the support for the Tory party was anything other than we're going to go this way because we don't want to go that way anymore. So, but yes, I do. I think it's a long-term rebuilding of trust, and it might be rebuilding something completely new. I don't know.
Okay, Nick, over to you.
Well, I think the one thing we've not mentioned is the sort of great anger in these former coalfield communities, in so many of the desolated communities. I mean, the fact that people could support UKIP, that they would go along with UKIP, you know, blaming Brussels for everything, fears over immigration. I think the fact that the popular press, the dominant popular press, had put over this propaganda for so long, I think, you know, the fact that Boris was prepared there to be appearing to be sort of supporting this kicking of the establishment, I mean, I think that made him a popular figure. And I think we can't disconnect from the power of the newspapers and the way that is picked up by the rest of the media. Looking to the future, I mean, I was very struck, and I'm very struck by the way in which the established trade union movement and the Labour Party probably aren't doing enough to communicate and to connect with all of the new groups of workers. I mean, we heard of the plight of ASOS workers at Grimethorpe. Well, are the established unions doing enough to connect with these new young workers who are on flexible contracts, on 0 hours contracts, the people who drive the Uber things, the app drivers? I mean, we've written in MediaNorth about the way in which new independent unions are coming in to sort of pick this up. So I think there's a lot of work that the Labour Party could do if it was prepared to target groups like that in rebuilding support. Finally, I mean, I was very interested in that reference to the COVID support groups. I was absolutely convinced during the miners' strike, when I say convinced now, looking back, that if the miners' welfare groups and the support and the miners' wives had been able to use, for example, things like social media in the way in which social media is used today, I think that they would have had a tremendous impact. And who knows, the sight of the hardship, if that had been transmitted in the way that these things can be transmitted today, I think it would have been very difficult for Mrs. Thatcher. So yes, I mean, I am certainly very hopeful, and I think we have seen the spirit that is there in the British communities, in the way the volunteers have come out and helped deal with the COVID jabs. I mean, it has been so refreshing. So I'm not as pessimistic about it, but I do worry that Labour has got a long way to go, and as an established party, to try and sort of tap into this what I think is potential latent support, if only it could sort of find ways of connecting. And I think the role for the Media North and for all of Granville's work is we've got to sort of try to draw attention to the way in which there are failings in communication, and that I think is something that is one way that perhaps activists like us can try and help the Labour movement.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Now I'm going to draw it to the close. It's nearly 4:30, but just 2 points very quickly. Hugh and Ray's book, The Shadow of the Mind. Verso, if you've been involved in this meeting, you can contact Verso. There is we've spread the link. You just go to it and you get a 50% discount on the book. So please, if you want to do that, if you can't find it, just email CPBF North. It's cpbfnorth@outlook.com, and we can send you the link to Verso if you want to buy the book. Secondly, a lot of familiar faces here today, but some new faces too. If you want to receive free copies of Media North, again, just email us at cpbfnorth@outlook.com, and we'll put you on the list to receive it. And finally, Hugh mentioned books we published. Nick has mentioned them. Hugh has contributed several of them, including Shafted, as well as Jean. But if you want to know about the books, Shafted, The Flame Still Burns, Pit Props, Settling Scores, the books we produce, again, send an email and we can send you the information. But I want to sincerely thank Hugh, Ray, Jean and Nick for taking part, and for all of you spending an afternoon. Ideally, if we'd have been at Wortley Hall now, it's looking quite nice, the weather here, but you never know. But anyway, let's hope, Pat, that we can have an event at Wortley Hall next year and it will be successful. I hope you've found it useful, informative. Thank you all very much. And thank you again to the speakers for taking part. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Nice to see you, Neil.
Cheers. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, he's gone now.
Bye.